Hello, friends. This is Carrie Morrison, and welcome to episode 1 of Heartforward Conversations from the Heart. There are so many people I want to introduce you to via this podcast and so many stories to tell. So where do I start? Truth be told, as soon as I set my mind on launching this podcast, I grabbed from my reading pile a 62-page report that was released in May of this crazy year, and I knew that I had found my inaugural episode. Why? Because you're going to hear from 2 mothers of adult sons living with mental illness who are among the strongest people I know. They are also incredibly knowledgeable about the complexities of a system that fails people over and over again. Teresa Pasquini and Lauren and Rettagliata set out last year to find examples of what they call housing that heals. Why would they go on a 3,170-mile road trip and visit over 20 locations throughout the state of California, and then come back home and draft a beautifully researched report that can be a resource for so many people? In their words, quote, "The answer is that for decades, we and thousands of families have been trying to build housing that will save our loved ones from living on the streets, jails, and grim care homes with untrained staff. Because we had so much ground to cover, I broke our conversation into 2 episodes. This week, we will hear about their family stories, their early frustrations trying to support their sons, and how they found themselves transformed into community activists. The road taken to their wisdom as mothers and activists was not easy." Thank you for listening today. So, welcome. I'm so delighted to have here for the inaugural first episode, Heartforward Conversations from the Heart, 2 people that I have been really admiring from afar, and am so excited that we get to be together to talk today. We are on this crazy Zoom experience that everyone is used to during this time of pandemic, but it is at least a way for us to see our faces. So I want to introduce Teresa Pasquini and Lauren Rettagliata. They kind of refer to themselves as moms on a mission, and they have been a force in trying to raise awareness about just the need for sustained and reliable and compassionate treatment for people with mental illness, and have a particular perspective as mothers of adult children who have had the struggle for a long time, and a deep-seated worry about where their adult children are going to live. You know, we all don't stay on this earth forever, and we worry about our children and how they're going to make do. So let's get to know them first. Both of you have your own kind of origin story, and maybe I'll start with you, Teresa. Tell us a little bit about your background and about your family's experience in this space.
So thank you so much, Carrie. It's a pleasure to join you, and I'm happy to share my family journey. And it's a journey actually that goes back 40 some years, starting with my older brother, who was diagnosed with a serious mental illness. And actually, my first defining memory of serious mental illness was the day my brother jumped off the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, one of the 3 Bay Area bridges in California. He had traveled across all 3 Bay Area bridges and chose the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge because it was the least congested. He had been having command hallucinations to kill himself to protect his family from the mafia. He went to the highest point of that bridge. He climbed over. He lowered his body. He let go and released his grip, and he survived. Obviously, his feet fortunately hit the water first, and he survived with a broken back and was rescued by local fishermen.
Wow.
So this was years ago, and he was rushed immediately to an emergency room. And once he was in an ICU, once he was stabilized, he was taken to psychiatric hospital here in the Bay Area. And that was also my first experience with going behind a locked door and seeing somebody in a psychiatric unit.
So what year would that have been, Teresa?
Oh boy, I just kind of estimate it's roughly 45 years ago.
Okay.
And it was, the 70s. So that was my first experience. And it was obviously a jolt to our family. But my brother did recover. He received long-term treatment. He was in a locked facility. He received long-term treatment. He came home to live with my mom and dad, and our family wrapped him in love and support. And my husband and I lent him money. He went back to school. He got his master's in special ed. He became a school teacher in the Richmond, California school district, taught for many years in areas that most teachers don't want to teach. He was a beloved teacher. He loved his students. And he maintained his recovery for many years with some slips along the way that we also helped him with. So that experience, and at the time, I remember my dad saying, don't talk about it. We shouldn't talk about it. And I'm like, Dad, it was in the paper. My brother had been a student body president in our local high school. So it was in the paper, it was covered. And so that was kind of my first kind of experience with the, don't tell. And I just didn't get it. But that stayed with me. Years later, then my beloved son, my firstborn son, was born. We brought him home to his first house, was the house that his dad built here in the Bay Area, and brought him through our front door as a baby, never dreaming that it would be the same door he would walk out of 40 times years later during a psychotic break in a 5150. I was fortunate to know that, when my son started getting sick in his teens, I was like, okay, I know what this is. This is our family illness, and this is going to be like my brother. Well, it was okay for a while. It worked. We got Danny into early therapy. He had a diagnosis. He had school supports. We were in family therapy, and we thought we'd managed his care until he became adult. And literally on his 18th birthday, he was 5150 for the second time. And that was when I realized that I had no rights. I mean, I called the hospital and said, I want an update on my son. And they said, sorry, we can't give you any information. And so literally overnight, I felt the powerlessness that so many moms like me feel. And it was the beginning of the 20-year nightmare we've been living here in California.
So I want to press pause on that right there, because that 18-year-old marker, as a person who has not experienced this, but learning about it, that was a shocker to me. So I want to come back to that here in a moment. Lauren, tell me a little bit about your story. Maybe come right up to that same marker, and then we can explore what that means when your adult child, your child suddenly, by virtue of the state's designation, becomes an adult.
Well, it's so good to be with both Teresa and Carrie during these Zoom moments. And I'm the mom of 4 sons. And my experience with this actually started with my first son, who is almost 48 now. And when he was diagnosed with he had some really tough problems as an infant, and we saw some very unusual things: hand flapping, not developing language, everything. And we brought him, and we were doing a lot of reading, and we thought, oh, this autism, it sounds like what our son has. So we went to Stanford University, and they evaluated our son, and they sent us home, and they said the problem was that we just weren't parenting him correctly. And so we we were excited. I mean, when you get a diagnosis that you're the problem, not your child, you're elated. You can fix yourself. You will commit to fixing yourself. And so the social workers came, they were allowed access into our house around the clock. And after the first visit, the social worker called up Stanford and said, we need to immediately come back. And this time they spent a long time with us. And the diagnosis was childhood schizophrenia. Because in that time period, in 1974, 75, they were not the diagnostic statistical manual that they used to give out the diagnoses of things that happen in the brain and then behavioral health and mental health, didn't recognize autism yet. So he was given childhood schizophrenia. And we tried to get him in the school systems in California, but they really didn't allow children with his intensity to go into the public schools. But we did find a school in Texas, school district in Texas. And so my husband was able to find a position there. Things are going along really, really well. He did really well. But then we were forced for economic reasons to move to Pueblo, Colorado. Turned out to be really good for our son. He was able to find some really, really good teachers. And at that time, he had 3 younger brothers. What the youngest brother, though, was doing okay. And he would score out with intense high IQ on all of his school exams. But his grades were never all that great. They were during elementary school. And they began to fall during middle school. So we tried a private school. He didn't like it. So we sent him to the public high school. And he flunked out of all of his classes, which is kind of unusual, seeing that he had such an intensely high IQ. So we didn't know what to do. So we sent him to military school, thinking that the structure, structure would really help him. And it did. He became a straight A student. He did really well. Then our family situation made it so we needed to move back to California to take care of all 4 of our parents who were very ill. And our youngest son was really excited about this because he had done all the benchmarks that we set to get back into regular school. And so we brought him back in. We put him in a private school that was nearby where we were located. And he did all right, but he wasn't getting the straight A's, but he was passing. He didn't seem to make many friends. And I came one day into the living room of the apartment where we were staying to find him with a knife poised at his brother's throat, saying that he had to kill Mark, that it was best for Mark, that he was being told to kill Mark.
Oh, my goodness.
So I was able to talk him down and get him to put down the knife. I got him in the car and I drove him to Kaiser. We had Kaiser insurance at the time. They brought us immediately in to see the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, I didn't know what a 5150 was. All of a sudden, they brought my son back in, they interviewed my son, and then all of a sudden I see a bunch of police officers arrive with the EMTs, and I find that my son is being taken to Herrick Hospital and that he is going to be placed in the psychiatric ward.
And how old was he then?
17 and a half.
Oh, boy.
And so that's all they could tell me, though, because at this time, they were very, very concerned about HIPAA laws. And since he was over 17 and really close to 18, we were kind of cut out of the picture. And he was then put into an intense program in Oakland called Thunder Road. And he was to stay there. They wanted him to stay there for a number of months. Within 5 days, we received a call from him saying that he had talked to the patient's rights person. He had gone to court. He had filed a writ of habeas corpus, and he had gotten himself out, that this was all just overblown, that he didn't have a diagnosis. And if you meet my son, you'll realize he can talk his way out of anything. And he talked us into believing he was A-OK. He was going to go to family therapy, and we were all going to work this out, and it was going to be okay. And it actually was for a while.
So let me pause there, because when I was in Italy, kind of exploring what they do with what you would call early onset schizophrenia or mental illness, families are completely pulled into the system, because why would you not? You sit down and you explore what is happening, what is the background, how do we work together for the good of the teenager or soon to be adult child. So I think this is going to shock a lot of parents. It's hard enough having a 17, 18-year-old dealing with leaving for college or trying to figure out what their life is, and then to have something like this happen, and suddenly you're cut out of it. So somebody mentioned HIPAA. I think, Lauren, you did. Let's talk about what is HIPAA. And then maybe, Lauren, tell us what is HIPAA. And then, Teresa, tell us what rights you lose as a parent when your child turns 18.
I'm going to be it's called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act or something. I'm going to get, we're so used to using acronyms that we sometimes forget what they actually stand for. But it was meant so that your personal records were your medical records were your own, and that insurance companies couldn't go spreading them all around, and that an employer couldn't just access them and find out. It never was intended, I don't believe, to keep parents and loved ones from finding out what their very seriously ill people who have mental illness, what their diagnosis is. I don't think it was meant to do that, but it has changed into that. And so that's what we are up against.
Yeah, it's become like a Teflon force field to prevent you from involvement. So, Teresa, you're a mother of an 18-year-old. What are your rights to try to be involved in helping to make the best decisions for that person?
So as I said, it was literally his 18th birthday that this happened. And, I watched him be put into the ambulance. I knew which hospital he was taken to. And when I called that hospital and asked for information, I was told, I'm sorry, he's 18. That was a shock. I don't think I even knew about HIPAA. So families like mine call this the HIPAA hammer or the HIPAA handcuffs that are slammed on us, when our adult loved ones are hospitalized for psychiatric purposes. And so, however, it was interesting that the hospital would call me and say, can he come home? And of course yes, of course he can, So that was the first beginning of it. And we basically lose the right to have any information on, what medications are needed, what therapies are needed, unless our loved one agrees. And fortunately, my Danny did agree to usually keep us in the loop. And so it wasn't always a problem.
Yeah, this issue of rights, which is so interesting, how we are so beholden to a person's constitutional rights. And you mentioned, Lauren, that the patient rights advocate at this particular facility where your son was living informed him, obviously, that he could go to court and seek to get out. And, and I often wonder, are the patient rights advocate actually thinking about what's ultimately good for this person? Because this may have set him on a trajectory of not receiving the care that he really needed at that time.
The one question that I'm asking as a loved one of someone who is very ill is, are the patient right advocates aware of the patient's history? I don't think that the patient's right advocate actually have before them the history of the person that they are advising. And I think that we now know that law enforcement needs to take into consideration the history of the person when they're called to the scene. We know that the doctors need to keep and know the history of the person. I hope now that we activate and get our patients' rights people to understand that they need to have an in-depth understanding of the person that they're counseling to also. And I think that would really might help out in some instances, though not all.
Yeah, if anything, the link between the patient rights advocate not knowing the history is because there's a HIPAA protection against them knowing the history. And so we're just in this endless circle. So for both of you now, boy, your adult sons are at this pretty important age where ideally, what do you ideally wish would have happened for them at that time, and what instead did happen?
I had my brother's experience to model for a model, and really had hoped. It was like when we got the diagnosis, it's like, okay, we know what this is, and we're going to get help, and we're going to get treatment, and it's going to be great. And and it just wasn't. It wasn't the same situation. And my son was very different from my brother, and And my son had severe anosognosia. He absolutely.
Can you define anosognosia? What is anosognosia?
Anosognosia is basically a lack of insight into being mentally ill. Some people call it denial. It's not denial. It's actually part of the brain illness that doesn't, makes them not realize that they have a serious mental illness. And so, and I compare it to my dad who had a stroke. And I remember, my dad experiencing similar symptoms as my son did. Versus my brother who did really understand and did exactly what he was told. It was, you have a mental illness. This is how you take care of it. And this is what you do. And that just wasn't the case for our son. And so sadly, it was the beginning, the 18th birthday was the beginning of a revolving door that went on for the next 15 years, really. And, after the first 3 hospitalizations right in a row, I received conservatorship papers in the mail.
And what is a conservatorship?
So a conservatorship is when the doctor says that you need long-term care, you need, to be placed in in a locked facility. And, it's a way to mandate treatment, basically, and to provide third-party, assistance and support. And some families are they're conservators for their family member. So I get these papers and I'm just like, what the heck? I remember crying in, driveway with my girlfriend and what are these? So it was when I called the office and said, I don't understand what this means. And I had this amazing gentleman that came into our family's life that said, your son's really sick and he needs long-term care. And so why do you keep bringing him home? So that was the first kind of hint that, if you offer a place for them to come back, then the system will let you. And so they won't give you the support that necessarily that you need to care for them. But so the system, California system, I think requires family members to make our loved ones homeless. It requires us to let them get to a point of danger to self and others. We had multiple suicide attempts here in our home. We had, the level of chaos and suffering for our son and our family was just horrific. And I know we're not alone in that. So we supported the conservatorship, never dreaming it would last 19 years.
Yeah. And for some families, it's hard to secure a conservatorship. So I suspect it's different from county to county. Lauren, a little bit about what you wished could have happened and maybe what actually did happen.
What I wish could have happened is that his father and I and the whole family, it's the whole family, would know exactly what the diagnosis was, that we would have been able to speak with Chris. But I now, after almost 20 years of doing this, that unless my son was conserved for a while, not forever, but let's say for maybe 3 months, 6 months, or maybe a year. That's what needed to happen in the very beginning, because my son knew that he was seriously mentally ill at times. That's what I have to say. It was at times. And then the illness would get so intense, it would take over. And he would believe that he wasn't ill, that everybody else in the world was, and that this was the hardest thing, because then you lose the ability to reason with someone. And when they think they don't have to take medication, when they find their only joy in life to be taking illicit street drugs, very intense street drugs, because that's the only thing that gives them a break, or where they say that my son says he feels any joy in his life. But he doesn't want to have a mental illness. So therefore, I believe, thinks that if I just act like I don't have one, it will go away. And so we've been in this 20-year vicious cycle where we have done family interventions to send him in, where he said he gets so ill at times where he has taken his life. He had a rifle to his head in our house. He agreed to go into care, but after being only in for a few days, got himself out. After a family intervention where he was the driver of a bus and actually hijacked the bus, he agreed to go down to Southern California into a co-occurring facility because
what is a co-occurring facility?
A co-occurring facility is that my son now, on top of having a serious mental illness, now had a serious drug problem. And so, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, we know it was the mental illness, but my son was hoping that he could just solve the addiction problem and that everything was going to be okay, but he was never able to because of the mental illness. And he would get better enough to get out and try and be on his own, would do it for, sometimes we had breaks of up to 2 years. At one point in his life, in his mid-20s, he was the most sought after person that he would give summonses out. The courts hired him he was a process server to give out the summons because my son was a strikingly handsome 6'4", 200 male. So who is going to question that person when they hand them their summons? So he was doing that really well. And then one day he came home and he told me I had to get in the car with him. He had to go to the courts in San Jose. And we had a wild ride from hell. And I tried to get him to come back in. And what he did was he just go back in for health. And what he did was he became lost in the underbelly of homelessness for a 3-year period where we were searching the deltas, the streets of San Francisco. Sometimes we would find him, but he would never really agree to come home until one night when he did. And it was right before Thanksgiving. And we had another period where things worked for a while. And just like some illnesses can be relapsing and remitting, mental illness can be relapsing and remitting. And that's the roller coaster ride that this family is on. But as years go on, if the illness is left untreated, it harms the brain more and more and more. And so now our son is not the same person mentally that he was 20 years ago. And it's a different story. And I pray that maybe one day we will get a conservatorship. Maybe this will help him. That's my story on that.
Yeah. So, I hope that people who are listening to this, certainly this has been my experience as I managed the bid in Hollywood, and I would see young men or women with a mental illness, sometimes with also substance abuse, wandering the streets. And I would always wonder, where is their family? And where is their family? And I think, it sounds like Danny did not have the experience of homelessness as Lauren's son did, Teresa, or maybe intermittent. But this is something for people to think about, that so very often there is a story of a lot of pain and anguish and attempts to help these adults we see languishing on our streets right now. And it's just incredibly heartbreaking. So let's pivot. Gosh, we could talk for hours about this. But I want to pivot to, first of all, how you both found each other. And then a little bit, we're going to learn in our next episode about the road trip you took last year to look at housing options for adults with severe mental illness. But first of all, how did you both meet? And tell us about also how you started to become focused on how inadequate the housing options are for people with serious mental illness in our state.
I first met Teresa when I became a mental health commissioner. And a mental health commissioner is a person who is a citizen advocate for those who are mentally ill. And I decided I had to find out more about how you get care in the public system. Because at one point we left the private system, that's a whole other story, went into the public system, and I needed to find out and learn what was available in the public system.
And what county were you a commissioner?
I was in Contra Costa County.
Okay.
So I went to my first commission meeting, and I saw this remarkable woman who knew so much. And so I actually became a stalker. I would try to, for about 2 or 3 months, I would try to engage her afterwards. And she probably thought, who is this crazy woman who doesn't know all that much? And finally, she gave me her phone number, and I would call her and ask her. And she helped me understand the system. She knew the system and how the system worked upside down and backwards. And so it was through her that I learned a lot. And my county supervisor in California, the supervisors have control of the money that comes in to help those with a serious mental illness, wanted to have assisted outpatient treatment. And I learned what it was from my supervisor, and I became like Crusader Rabbit, that this I felt was going to, if my son couldn't be conserved, maybe there was an opportunity where he would listen and get more treatment if he was in assisted outpatient treatment. And so this is where I really joined Teresa on this quest to get this in our county. Now, we know it's not the answer for everything. We know it's a tool in the tool belt of mental health. But it's an essential tool, and it's not a tool that's going to work for everyone. But I could not believe the fight we had with our supervisors and getting our supervisors to realize that this was not going to cost them a fortune and was probably going to save them a lot of money. That's how I met Teresa. And
so Teresa, did you really think she was a stalker? Like, you finally relented and gave this crazy woman your phone number?
No, I could spot somebody that was going to be an effective advocate and partner. And so I don't remember it that way. I was very impressed with Lauren when she first came in, and she was very intent on learning. And I welcome that. There are so many folks that join commissions that they're just focusing kind of on their personal agenda. And, it's so important to be able to create a shared agenda with our community. And so Lauren became a great partner. I was I think vice chair of the commission, full commission, and then I was chairing the MHSA finance committee, and she joined my committee. And so it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as they say.
So tell me a little bit about, obviously you worked on the assisted outpatient treatment policy, and you have found other things that you have linked your arms around. But this decision to begin to look at housing, the adequacy of housing for adults with severe mental illness, what motivated you to be so focused on exploring that for the rest of us to understand?
Well, I was always told by all of my son's case managers, and when you go to the county to receive behavioral health, mental health, you are assigned a case manager. And when the case management didn't work, he was to be placed in what they called a full service partnership. And I'm going over this rather quickly, but in all of this, there were a number of 5150s involved to move from case management to full service partnership. And everyone said, what you need is housing. Get him housing first, and then we'll wrap all the services around him. So my husband and I were able to purchase an apartment in the area and allow our son to live there in hopes that the supportive services would be given to him. What people don't realize is that when someone is so severely ill, the people who are to bring the services to them knock on the door. And many of the time, almost all the time, my son did not answer the door. In fact, he got so intensely ill, and he was in a full service partnership, that they called us one time and they said nobody has seen him in the complex. And we had been calling them also, but there's so many people in the chain of command. We had been calling and saying, our son hasn't called us in 5 days. We check in every day via phone, or we go over. And we would go over to the apartment, knock on the door, and nobody would answer. Finally, we got a welfare check, and the police found him comatose floor. And it was a very sad situation. And so housing first did not work for my son at all. A lot of experience in housing with my older son. So housing became my bailiwick. I was going to find out how we get housing that works for people who are seriously mentally ill, because housing first works for some, but it's not the answer for all.
Teresa, in the report that you both wrote, the Housing That Heals report, you take this on right at the beginning by saying that housing first, which is a national policy for addressing homelessness, I always like to think that there's in the bell curve of people who need housing, there's this upper edge of the bell curve that cannot survive in housing first. Do you agree with that? And what are you looking for if it's not housing first?
I think that that's one of the reasons we focused on the population that we focused on. And we know that it works for some people, and we celebrate that. And we don't want anybody to suffer, and we don't want anybody on the street. But we talk about there being a system of homefulness. And there needs to be a continuum of care that includes tiered levels of housing. And I developed a very strong system perspective. You know, I had to take my anger wall down. I had to develop partnerships. I had to learn what was going on behind the doors of the hospitals and the health centers. And I wanted to tell them what was going on behind my door. And I wanted to help those that had no doors. You know, the first experience, my real experience with homelessness was when my son was living at home, was doing very well, and wanted a friend of his that he had reconnected with in a hospital to come and live with us. It was his girlfriend. And so we were like, okay. And she was homeless. And so we took her in and fell in love with her and learned her story and learned her experience, and I did everything I could to connect her with services. I got her into a full service partnership, et cetera. And it was through her experience that I learned, how broken the system was, because Danny had a conservatorship. He had private insurance. He had mom and dad, but this young woman had been on the streets since she was 15 and had been very sick, but yet she was so amazingly wonderful and would come up every morning and have coffee with me, and we would chat, and I would hear her story. And, you know, she wanted to be well. You know, that was a difficult time. It's not easy to have one family member. And so that worked for a long time, but, you know, for a couple of months, I should say. And then it stopped working. And that was actually when we set boundaries around drug and alcohol use in the house. That didn't last. And so it was the first time that we actually followed through and said, you know, you can't live here. And so they were homeless together and for a period of time. And then that was my first experience. Then, of course, I couldn't handle it. I had developed these partnerships and I was just, hammering the county, they're on the street. She's a full service partner. He's conserved. What do we do? And so fortunately they were given a motel room. And so from there, I remember having to go to court. Danny's conservatorship was up for renewal. He almost got off conservatorship, even though, he shouldn't have been. And the judge said, well, okay, if he's going to be in this full service partnership and go, live and have this, support system around him, then I'm going to continue the conservatorship. But, I want him in an unlock. He can live in the community. Well, so they were put in an apartment, and that apartment, I'll never forget, was down in an area that, was not safe, was not okay. If it weren't for my husband and I helping them get what they needed to move in, they wouldn't have had what they needed. We moved in. It was a dirty apartment. It hadn't been cleaned. And I was outraged, actually, by what I saw. And I remember at the time, this is when, all the state partners were touting full service partnerships, and they were the end all be all. And, it was going to be whatever it takes. And so, we didn't want our son institutionalized. We didn't want him homeless. We didn't want him jailed. We wanted him to have freedom and purpose and a girlfriend and live on his own. But they needed support, and they didn't get it. And that first experience ended in such deep tragedy for both of them, actually, that I got a phone call from Jessica one day saying Danny's been carving on his throat all night. And we called the 24/7 hotline, the one that they're given, that they called for help and nobody answered. So she called me and I called 911, and I was able to get down to the apartment in time to see my son being taken away in an ambulance. And then to have law enforcement tell me that he had to be tased. He had to be chased into the back of the room and tased. And so it took years and years for him to recover. Jessica ended up back on the streets and didn't recover. So it was a very traumatic, horrible experience. And it didn't have to be that way. And this is for people that were conserved. Danny had private insurance and had mom and dad. And so it was not okay.
And also, just for people who aren't familiar, the full service partnership is presumably the gold standard case management access funded by Prop 63, the millionaire's tax in 2004, the Mental Health Services Act. And I think we all hear that it's not an even experience from county to county how those full service partnerships play out. So we're almost to the end of this discussion, and I again, you must have one day over coffee or whatever said, let's go see what's available in California, the good, the bad, and the ugly, perhaps. Or how did you decide to do this, and how did you determine what residential facilities were going to make the cut for your amazing 2019 road trip?
Well, we had tried as family members, as advocates, to build housing right in our own county. And we almost got there. We tried to build a residential therapeutic farm where that would house about 12 to possibly 16 people. We got the funding, we got everything almost in line, and then it fell apart at the last minute. But in doing so, we remember Teresa had the history. She knew the history, and she said, and another friend of ours who has now left the state, Gloria, told us about this wonderful place in Orange County called the John Henry Foundation. And so I said to Teresa, you know what? I want to go see this place. I want to lay my own eyes on it. I want to see how they do things. And so I worked with our friend Gloria. I found a board member on the John Henry Foundation. This is a private facility. But we heard that it was so good. We wanted to see what was so good about it. And so we got everyone on board. We got the board of directors to open the doors for us. And we went down and we saw the John Henry Foundation. And we were amazed because for $42,000 a year, and that sounds like a lot of money, but it really isn't, because I had just gotten through paying a few years before $10,000 a month for my son at a place. And that's where he actually experienced, within the last 5 years, the most healthy period in his life. So I knew I wanted to find some place that we could make affordable to people who are in the public system. Because when you are very seriously mentally ill, you are probably in the public system. So we started out with the John Henry Foundation. And when we saw what was happening, we then began to make a list of where are the other good places that we have heard of in California that we can see. And we scattered ourselves throughout the state.
Okay. That's how it happened. And we're going to talk about your top 5 in the next episode. Did you plan to have it, Teresa, take a whole year? I mean, that is a big commitment to visit. I think you visited about 20 different places.
We had actually, I just thought, okay, yay, let's go to LA, and have fun. And we had a blast, taking off. And we were doing this as a favor to our friend Gloria. And we were so moved by what we saw. And all I could think of is, oh my goodness, if my Danny would have been here years ago, maybe he wouldn't have suffered so much for so long. And so that created we on the way back said, well, you know what, we have to make this a project. And we weren't sure. We weren't sure. We kind of thought that we would focus on Contra Costa, but then we soon realized, we knew that the state was doing the No Place Like Home process, and we knew that there was funding coming in. We knew we had a governor who was committing to ending the homelessness problem, but we were concerned that those that were at risk of homelessness were not going to be captured in this process. And so no, we had no intention of it being a year, and I had no intention of it taking 6 months to write, and do the research. But we are very proud. We're very proud of we loved our experience, and we're very proud of it.
I think you have done a great service to so many people in the intentional way in which you approached it and how you described these different locations. And also just the report is so enlightening about our system. And we couldn't even possibly go into the ins and outs of the complexity of the public mental health system. But that's why there will be a link to your report in the show notes for this episode, and people can do a deeper dive. So I'm going to bring this episode to a close, and we will come back again next week to actually hear about 5 of these places and a little bit about your sense of hope for the future. So I want to thank both of you for being here today on the first episode of Heartforward, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I could have talked all day to these 2 amazing women, and I have learned so much from not only this interview, but also their report, Housing That Heals. You can find a link to that report in the episode notes, and I hope you will join me next week when we complete this conversation and visit 5 places that were particularly memorable from their 2019 road trip. In the meantime, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast and tell others about it. I want to thank my collaborating partners at Peer Mental Health for providing technical support, and in particular, Paul Robinson, who is helping me with this podcast today. I'll see you next week.